Philanthropic Luncheon with Natasha Boyd. I want to thank Rosemary Patterson for having this wonderful and making it happen, and all the volunteers and the Dataw staff who have helped. DHF is committed to keeping history alive and are thankful to our members for their constant support. If you are not a member and would like to, we would love to have you. There are membership forms on the check-in table. Your membership money helps us preserve the ruins. All the money that we collect for membership goes to restoring the ruins, having to take care of the tapping, and doing archaeological digs. And we have just completed another project, which is we've sent a drone out into the marsh, where we've looked at all the cotton dikes that are out there, and we found that there was a fresh water stream that ran from the Oak Island Bridge all the way down to Sparrow's Nest, and that stream was called Sparrow's Nest Creek. And that was why they put the cotton dikes out there, because that's where they needed the fresh water, so they could grow rice and cotton. So the gentleman who helped us with that is going to put together a report and submit it to the state to see if we cannot get that as a National Historic Site. So that would be number 2. And I also wanted to let you know that we have decided, because a generous person on the island, when she and her husband passed away, donated some money to the Historic Foundation, and we're taking that money to do a scholarship for a student at the American College for the Building Arts in Charleston. And that college teaches masonry, plastering, woodworking, ironwork, all the things that you need to restore buildings and where you can't find these types of artisans. And the students run from the age of 18 to 52. A woman who had bought a house in Savannah couldn't find anybody to do her plastering, so she decided to sign up, and she went to the college, and she's now a 4-year student. They also give a bachelor. It's a 4-year school. They also give a Bachelor of Arts degree. So this is our first year doing this, and we hope to be able to continue to do it for many years to come. And their graduates go, right now there's a Mason graduate, a plaster graduate, who's going to be working in Washington, D.C. And he's going to be working on the White House, and he's going to be working on the Capitol. So these kids get wonderful jobs because they're very much needed. So that's another thing that we are doing now. So I hope you enjoy your lunch, and I know you're going to have a wonderful time listening to Natasha, and thank you all so much for coming. Happened. After I attended the fireside chat in January, I thought, who would I want to speak? And only one name came into my head, and that was Natasha Boyd. I learned a long time ago that you have not if you ask not. So on January 31st, I went to her Facebook page, and I sent her a message. And it said exactly this: do you ever do speaking engagements to groups? And here we are. It's really exciting for me to see the sea of blue. Thank you, everybody who wore blue. Before we hear from Natasha, we are very lucky on this island to have so many talented people. We are going to have 3 speakers, and they all know that they have 5 minutes. First, we're going to have Carolyn Tedeschi, and she is going to talk about her love of growing indigo right here on Dataw. After her, we're going to have Lori Thompson, and she's going to talk about her love of dyeing indigo. And then Bill Risky is going to explain the connection of indigo and Dataw. So here are your next 3 speakers.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Rosemary, I think, for inviting me. I am hardly an expert here. So let's start with indigo. What is it? To most of us, it's a rich dark blue color extracted from plants. But what plant? We have 800 or so plant species across the globe that contain indigo, which is the substance when combined in solution with enzymes and oxygen, produces indigotin, which is the main blue substance of indigo. It's the oldest natural source of blue dye in the world. Humans have been dyeing with it for about 6,000 years. Because of its high trade value, indigo was often referred to as blue gold. It was a major export and cash crop in South Carolina in the 1700s. But I'm going to let Bill, this guy, give us more of those details. Synthetic indigo was developed in 1880 by a German chemist called Adolf van Baer. With his discovery, it led to much cheaper and easier production of indigo, and the indigo trade pretty much fell off worldwide. So anyway, back to the actual plants. As mentioned earlier, there are many plant species that contain this called blue gold, but there are only a handful of these plants that contain high enough levels of indigo to make growing them for dye production actually worthwhile. I mean, let's be real. We want the most color for the least amount of effort. From my limited research, it appears that there are about 8 or 10 plant varieties originating from the Americas to India, West Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Japan that are used by natural dyers. All of these plants generally require a long growing season with plenty of light and heat, and they are not frost tolerant. If you're interested, I did have pictures of these out front on my table if anyone wants to see what I found. These leaves are harvested as the plant begins to bloom when the indican levels are thought to be highest in concentration. Some varieties of cultivated indigo, Japanese indigo in particular, can have up to 3 harvests per season. I personally began my interest in indigo a number of years ago while I was still living in California. I have long dabbled in fiber arts and noted a significant increase in interest in natural dyeing, both of fabric and yarn. In particular, I followed the progress of a gal by the name of Christine Behar. She's a noted textile artist from Oakland, California. She's written several books on natural dyeing, opened her own business. And she dyes natural fabrics and yarn, growing many of her plants, including indigo, in her tiny little yard in Oakland. After moving here in 2020, I learned of the significance of indigo in our community's history. And I just thought I'd see if I could grow it in the community garden. So I ordered a pack of seeds. I planted them indoors in January of 2021, and nothing grew. I said, huh. So I ordered another packet. I did a bit of reading and I tried again. This time I got 2 plants to sprout. I babied those babies all summer. And I did a lot more reading, including reading the book Indigo Girl. Armed with growing lights, a heat mat, and a new appreciation for what I was getting into, I tried again in January of 2022. And I was able to plant a whole row of Japanese indigo in my garden. Since then, I've participated in Lori's dye class. I've taken a few other local classes and invested in a few books. I was also able to experiment with a few fresh leaf dyeing techniques. There are many, many ways to dye with indigo. And I'm still learning a lot of that. I've also dried a batch of leaves that are patiently waiting further dye experimentation when I have time. This year I planted 3 varieties of indigo, including the variety of Subfructosa, which is also known as watermelon indigo, which I believe is the one that was planted here by Eliza Lucas Picnic. I have each of the displays of those plants on my table, and hopefully they're going to grow really nicely in the garden all summer long. So far, what have I learned? Indigo is hard to germinate. How they did it back in the day, I'm not sure. Once it sprouts, it's pretty easy to grow. It needs lots of sun, water, and heat. You will notice in the garden about the only thing that will be growing in my garden in July and August is hot peppers and indigo. Just loves it. I have some challenges with adequate sun at the community garden, which might be limiting the intensity of the blue that I obtain from my plants, but I'm still working on it. My personal goals are to keep experimenting, growing different varieties, see which grows best here and which will give me the darkest color. And I'm trying to grow enough indigo to actually ferment it and actually make dye pigment, which I think would give us really nice dark color. Experiment with more dye techniques. Anybody have any questions? I'm going to turn it over to Lori, who's going to tell us more about dyeing.
My name is Lori Thompson. When I first moved here to Dataw in 2018, one of the things that I enjoyed about the island was the history. I love history. And then I started reading Bill's pieces, and I loved history even more. It was short, to the point, and it gave us lots of information, especially about our area around here and the families that lived here on our island. And I would visit Fort Fremont, Penn Center, and all of those other places. I had some friends coming to visit me for a long weekend, and the guys were gonna golf, and the women were on their own. And she'd already done carriage rides and stuff like that, so I was looking for something to entertain my friend with. And we both like to kind of experiment artistically. I saw this class, believe it or not, St. Helena Library, Indigo class, free. They were going to do a history talk and a demonstration. So I signed us up. Oh, and it was supposed to rain that weekend too, so I had to find something inside, which it was. And we started out with the history, which I really enjoyed. And then not only did the speaker demonstrate the dyeing process, she gave us all a piece of cloth. This is my first attempt ever at dyeing indigo. And when I saw the chemical changes from the vat, moving the blossom over and putting my hands down in that warm water, it looks, a lot of you know from the class, and I try and share this, it looks like a greenish yellow color. And when you bring it out, well, you have added chemicals to it for, to get a reaction. When you bring it out and it hits the oxygen and that blue color starts changing, it's amazing. So for me, every piece is unique and everyone is an artist. You can turn it, fold it, wrap it, do whatever you want, and it's going to be a very unique piece. That's what I try and do in my classes. I wanted to make sure that the people here that took the class would be able to see the rich history we have here. And, we do a 4-hour class or 4.5-hour class, but the folks in the history are, that originated, dying, growing, like Carolyn does. We always take a walk over to the garden and I show the plants and flowers that are usually on there when I give the class in October. And it's beautiful to see the plant, the vat, and then the things that people actually produce there at the class. And like Carolyn, it's a very distinct blue dye. It is insoluble in water, and it has to go through a reducing process and be put back in a liquid state without oxygen, which is how they would ship it during the early days in cakes after they withdrew the water. And then again, that yellow, greenish, effervescent color when you add chemicals to it to help it change to the indigo color. And the blue, you never know what you're going to get, and that's the uniqueness of it for me. And I really enjoy doing it. I hope to add another class in October. thank you all who have participated in the past. Yes?
Are there other racial propagated besides growing in from seed?
There is synthetic indigo now. I use a combination. Carolyn would have to speak to that.
Japanese indigo can be propagated from cuttings.
From cuttings, yes, she did tell us that. And when you leave, look at her plants out there. The indigo this fall was a shorter version. I don't know if you can see me here. It was a shorter version. It was about like this. The indigo tenturium is usually a pretty high shrub and bush. So there is a little bit of difference.
I hope to have that growing this year.
Yeah.
It's planted.
The first year,
It's tall so far.
right, the first year she had that. Last year she had the Japanese indigo. And this year you're gonna try all three different types. Okay. Thank you.
Well, folks, for those that don't know me, I'm Bill Riskag with the Dataw History Foundation, and it's my pleasure to talk to you here for 5 minutes today about the blue heart of Dataw, indigo, and its legacy here. Elizabeth Lucas was born in 1722 on Antigua. Her dad was George Lucas. He was a British military officer. And when she was 15 years old, in 1738, he moved the family down to the Charleston area. The reason why is that he had inherited 3 plantations from his father, and the Antigua area in the Caribbean was in constant battle between the French, the Spanish, and the English at the time, and he thought Charleston would be safer. So moved the family down. They lived on the Wapu Plantation, which is on Wapu Creek. It's a tidal creek that runs between the Ashley River on the west side of Charleston to the Stono River, on the side of the break between James and Johns Island. And she was 15 years old, as I said. A year later, her dad was recalled to active duty, and he was sent back to Antigua to be the lieutenant governor. Now, she was 16 years old. She had a much younger sister. Her mother was pretty ill for most of her life. She had 2 brothers that were younger than her. She was the oldest. But the 2 brothers were away in England. So the dad asked her to watch after the 3 plantations at 16 years old. Unbelievable. She had a real love of botany, and her dad would send her seeds from Antigua, all different plants for her to try growing. And of course, the one that was the most lucrative and that she sort of figured out was indigo. In 1744, she married her widowed neighbor, Charles Pinckney. There's a little bit of a scandal there because he had been a widow for 8 months that she married him. But anyhow, they were very happily married. Also in 1744, that's the year that she finally had some success with the particular indigo that then got approved by the British government as being high enough quality to be bought by them at a premium price and used to dye the British Navy uniforms. 1744. I'll race past the rest of the family history other than to say late in life, she outlived her husband and her parents, but late in life she moved to Philadelphia because she had breast cancer. And she went there to get treated for it. She dies in 1793, but it's interesting to note that the lead pallbearer at her funeral was George Washington. So on to indigo. The heyday of indigo in the Carolina Sea Islands was 1747 to 1802. It did take off as she had predicted once the British wanted it. And the peak, in terms of value of it, there's 2 things to note. One is it was never exported to Britain in the volume that rice was. But indigo per pound fetched a price 10 times rice did. So it was very lucrative. In 1775, the million pounds of dye that they exported to Britain cost in today's dollars the equivalent of $30 million. But back to Dataw. I'm getting to Dataw. So, in 1744, when the indigo was taking off, up in Charleston that she was doing, and it was just about to get approved by the British government. She wanted to get the supply ahead of demand a bit, so she started giving seeds away for the plants that did really well that she experimented with to her neighbors. One of those neighbors was Robert Sams, the father of William Sams, that bought our island here. Fast forward 10 years, Nathaniel Barnwell is the biggest indigo planter in Beaufort District. He has 3,000 acres here, with indigo being grown, including covering half of Paris Island. By the 1760s, indigo was grown all over the area, including on Dataw, St. Helena, Port Royal, and Paris Island. And then Lewis Reed was the first documented case. So we knew in the 1760s that must have been grown here, but Lewis Reed in 1770, who inherits Dataw from his mother, she's Barnwell, so she's in the Sams family chain. He is documented as having planted indigo on Dataw in 1770. 1783, William Sams buys the island from his cousin Sarah Gibbs. And as evidenced by the fact that his father, Robert Sams, had grown indigo, and that his uncle, Nathaniel Barnwell, was the biggest indigo planter in Beaufort District, there's no doubt in my mind that indigo was grown here. As a matter of fact, remember, sea island cotton didn't really arrive here until about 1795 or a little bit later. So from the time that William Sams bought Dataw in 1783 until he died in 1798, indigo was probably the crop that was the flywheel for his wealth. Of course, sea island cotton took over after that. And then one last thing that I'll mention is we did some interviews with longtime employees of Dataw about 15 years ago. And one of the stories we were told by several different employees was that Bill Cochran, the Alcoa VP that developed Dataw, had indigo and cotton planted around the cannery. And there you go, indigo and Dataw, the blue heart of Dataw.
A little bit about Natasha Boyd. Natasha is a world-renowned bestseller and award-winning author of contemporary romance, comedy, and historical fiction, our favorite. She also publishes under the name of Tasha Boyd, and that's for her romance novels, and there are some out on the table. She grew up mainly in England, but also lived on several different continents. Her books are published in German, French, Italian, Turkish, Serbian, Russian, Czechoslovakian, and Indonesian. They are sold in 65 different countries. She and her husband Stephen and their 2 sons are currently living in Spain. Currently living in Spain. She told me she'd be here for 2 weeks visiting her family over Easter. And she so kindly said she would come here, a time taken away from her family. Indigo Girl was long listed for the Southern Independent Bookseller Association's Okra pick. On Dataw, it's our #1 pick, Natasha Boyd.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I can't tell you how actually overwhelming it is to come here and know that so many book clubs are here. Can I just see book club groups that are here? That's amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, there are so many books to choose from, and I know that it's obviously your local history, but it's just such an honor to pick the Indigo Girl from all the things that you can pick to read. Thank you first to Rosemary for hounding me. No, I know you didn't, but I have this weird thing that I didn't set up, I don't know how it works, but on Facebook, it'll be like, you got a message on Facebook, and it's on my author page, which is not my regular personal page, and I don't know how that works, but it sends her these automated messages. Hi, we'll be back to you in 24 hours or whatever. So I get there and Rosemary's been having a conversation with a bot. I was like, I'm so sorry. So I responded and then we moved to email, so we figured it out. But
thank you for being persistent and being open to, she did ask me to come speak this fall. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I have moved to a different continent. I really want to speak to you, and I will be there in April. And then she wrote back after a week, and she's like, we're going to do it. We're going to pull it off. And I was like, okay, I'll be there. So that was really fantastic. And y'all, can you just look at your amazing attention to detail here? Like the flowers on the table, the flower pots, the candles, the napkins. She really did an extraordinary, well, and everybody who helped her, thank you so much, did an extraordinary job. So, and everybody, a lot of people are wearing indigo. This is not natural dyed. I'm not sure, actually, I can't remember where I got this, but the color blue has always absolutely fascinated me. And I just want to quickly say that Bill did most of my talk in his little summary, so, you know, if it gets boring, you've heard it before. So let me quickly tell you my accent. Everyone's like, wait, how did this person who didn't grow up in the Low Country come across this story? So that's my husband back there. Chauffeur, husband, videographer, doesn't matter. He is from Charleston, and his family, he grew up in Charleston. And when we met, we lived in Atlanta, and we would always visit Charleston. And it's interesting because having grown up in England mostly, and I think where I went to university was like, you know, less than a mile away from where the Magna Carta was signed. Like, my idea of history was a lot, you know, it was more ancient. And I would come to Charleston, and in fact, his uncle was absolutely adamant that we had to meet each other. We were set up on a blind date. And he was into historic preservation. And I remember going, okay, well, 300 years. What? I very much took it for granted. But it's so interesting. And you guys probably have this feeling, especially those of you who didn't grow up here and who moved here, is that the Low Country, really as soon as you cross its borders, begins a slow and irrevocable seduction on your senses. And all of a sudden, you're very much passionate about the Low Country. For me, obviously, it took several visits and falling in love with my husband, who's from the Low Country, for that sort of feeling to be complete. But when we visited Charleston, I never really heard, I mean, you hear the name Pinckney a lot because there's the Pinckney Historical Site, which is Eliza's son, which is in Mount Pleasant. And when we moved to Hilton Head for a few years, 2010 to 2014, we would cross the Pinckney Island Refuge. It's like, there's that name Pinckney again. Like, who are these people? And it was only when my bonus mom was visiting, she's my stepmom, and my dad remarried, and she was coming to visit and see the grandkids, and we had done the trolley tours. Whoever was speaking earlier, who was like, man, didn't know how to entertain the guests, let's do an Indigo dining workshop. That's kind of what happened to me, is we had done all these tours, and I saw that there was an Indigo exhibit at a gallery in Hilton Head, and if you've read the notes at the end of the book, this story will be familiar. But at that evening, there were textile makers and dyers, people who worked with the indigo pigment. They used it for papers and jewelry, and some people, were painting, mixing in with paint. And it was fascinating. But the pivotal moment was that there was a living Eliza Lucas Pinckney there, Margaret Pickett, or Peggy Pickett, who's still practicing living history talks. And she was in costume and talking in the first person, that she was Eliza. And I was fascinated completely fascinated. And we left that evening with me going, this is crazy. I can't believe that this young girl existed, and I don't know anything about her. And I'm married to a man from Charleston, and we visit here, and we're going to plantations, we're doing talks and historical outings, and here's this girl that I've never heard about. So, of course, I was obsessed with her story, tried to do as much research as I could, but, you know, sort of just on the surface of things, there just wasn't that much about her, and I realized I was going to have to go a little deeper. And it did get to the point where I really wished that somebody had written a book about her. And so my husband sweetly looked at me askance and said, well, you write. But I was like, I don't write those kind of books. Right? I write contemporary romance. Love my romance readers. But no, it was a passion project. And the more I read and the more I discovered, and the more I realized the legacy that she left behind, I just could not let the story go. And I think it was January 2014, I was at the Francis Marion Hotel for a publishing conference, and I was speaking to my agent, who's now my agent. She wasn't my agent at the time. And she said to me, what book is in your heart that you're too afraid to write? Oh, what a question. I kind of just, like, my hair stood on end, and I was like, what? And I just started talking, and my brain was saying, shut up, she's going to make you write it. And so, yeah, so in the end, we have this book, right? But it was incredible because there were so many times that I thought, I'm not the person to write her story. I'm going to have to just, like, I'll do the research, that's fine, but that's not for me. And trying to understand the contextual history. I mean, we didn't do a lot of Southern history in my history class in England. And besides which, I loathed history in school, which had more to do with Mr. Whitehead than history. But when I went back for it was a 25th year reunion, and Mr. Whitehead was now the principal, and I told him that I was working on historical fiction, and he belly laughed. I was really put out, and I laughed politely along, but I was a little shocked. But yeah, I wasn't really well known for my history prowess. So, you know, his history was memorizing days and the Normandy and, you know, William the Conqueror, and I was just dates and dates and dates and dates and dates and dates. So if you could regurgitate all that back, you would get an A. That wasn't my idea of interesting history. So, needless to say, by the time I got that box of books from the publisher, with the first, the book that you see in front of you, I couldn't believe that we had done it, because my first instinct was, Eliza I finally got her story told. I mean, it really felt like her determination dragged me kicking and screaming through the pages of the book. So let's talk about that, because writing a historical fiction, and I think we have this with Virginia who's writing historical fiction, writing a fiction story from history is quite challenging, because you want it to be a story that everyone enjoys, and there's a certain cadence to storytelling. You know, there's the highs and the lows, and there's the dark night of the soul, and you know, hopefully there's an uplifting ending, unless you're, you know, going for Pulitzer Prize and everybody has to be dead or buried at the end. So it was difficult to try and tell her story, and still you wanted to stick as much as possible to the historical timeline and not have so many people involved. The first iteration that went to my agent, you know, she was like, there's too many people. I was like, well, this is Charleston. The Militons and the Ravenels, everybody has to be represented. You know, your drawing room conversations everyone's going to be shocked if they don't make it into pages. But she was like, no. You can have one person have 3 different conversations. It could have been 3 people, but for the sake of a commercial fiction, we're going to get one person. It's like, okay. So it was a lot of editing and that sort of stuff to basically just distill the essence of Eliza's story, and not just Eliza's story, but the world that she was living in. And the fact that Eliza wrote letters, lots of letters, and not only that, but made copies of every single letter she ever wrote is incredible, and pretty much the only reason why I was able to write the book. If you've seen the letter book of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, obviously that period of time, the Indigo Girl, is a very small, early part of the rest of the letters that she wrote. However, what those did was inform me of the kind of person that she was, and the kind of things that she believed in, the kind of things she would go to bat for. And I think it was when I read the letter that she wrote to her dad about Mr. L, when she said, because obviously she was totally rebuffing her parents' attempts to get her married off. She had too much to do. She had things to plant. She had a legacy. She felt that she had a legacy. Nobody asked it of her, but she was determined. And she wrote this letter to her dad about Mr. L that said, if you put the riches of Peru and Chile together, you still could not purchase sufficient esteem for me to make him my husband. And I thought, okay, I see you now. I see who we're talking about. And, so many times during the writing of the book, I thought, you know what would be better? If we'll do a contemporary story where a young girl today finds out about Eliza, and we do like this young adult, but we, discover back and forth. But then eventually I realized I had to just be Eliza for the book, because there was so much about her that was so nuanced and so complex. But because of that, we had to create some other characters. Ben, Sarah, people who had, I would say, sort of in playwright terms, more speaking roles, because there was so much that needed to be shown to Eliza about the world she was living in that was difficult to express through her point of view. The world she was living in was a world with enslaved humans, and there's no way that anybody who lived at that time, I had somebody write to me recently and say, why wasn't she an abolitionist? And I was like, well, that didn't exist until 100 years later. But, there was so much about that time. You can't write her story without really understanding the world she was living in. And there was so much about that, things that were happening, Sarah being terrified that her children were going to be sold, and, the evil overseer, as I call it, Stara on the other plantation, was taking advantage of the female enslaved people who were there. That is a very common thing, and so you can't write Eliza's story and just write it in a vacuum as if these things were not happening. And so, the world in which she lived sort of just grew and grew and grew. The more I read, the more I studied, the more, the stories from the Sea Islands about the evil overseer. Poor Starrett, in my book, may not have been as evil as some of the people that I read about, but, and maybe her mom wasn't as thoughtless as maybe she was in real life. But, when you're telling a fiction story from history, and you've got to make a point, it definitely, those people become really important to telling a story. And her mother was, so Eliza wrote about everything. Eliza wrote about the mockingbirds outside the window, the books she was reading, where they were traveling, what was growing. She would write these letters back to Mrs. Bodycott in England, and she never mentions her mother. And that, to me, told me a lot more about their relationship, I think, than if she had just, written her sort of thing. My mom's driving me crazy, in her words. But I was very fortunate to be at an event, Pat Conroy's last event, where he was raising money for literacy, and a few of us authors were asked to sign. And I was still working on the Indigo Girl. And I was sitting next to Peggy Pickett. And I was like, I met you before, you won't remember. But you were doing this Living Eliza Lucas Pinckney thing, and I remember you. And I just stopped there. And she said, oh, okay. Well, I'm working on a book about her right now. My heart stopped. And then she went on to say that she was writing her biography. And I was like, oh, okay, because I'm writing a historical fiction book, so this is fine. We can coexist. But could you hurry up and write that? Because I'm really as source material. But she was doing a lot of amazing research. Sadly, it didn't come out until after the Indigo Girl, but she was a very early reader of the Indigo Girl, and I was very grateful for her. But also, in addition to understanding Eliza and the historical context of what was going on, and the legacy of Indigo, I had to really understand Indigo. And I'm so glad that Rosemary and the Dataw Society arranged for Laurie and Carolyn to talk, because it's extremely difficult to understand Indigo. And I got to that part of the book, and I realized I didn't know what I was talking about. There's just, I can kill mint. So for me to understand what was happening with Indigo was just a little overwhelming. And not to mention, and I think one of them alluded to the difficulty of how you get dye. And I'm just going to read you a little quote from a textile maker, Catherine Legrand, who is a textile, Catherine Legrand, because she lives outside of Paris. But she wrote this beautiful coffee table book called Indigo, the Color That Changed the World. And she says, how did a Chinese dyer, a Mexican weaver, and a woman cloth dyer in Mali, thousands of miles and sometimes thousands of years apart, each discover how to make this dye from a local plant? In fact, when the recipe for getting the blue dye out of the leaves is done, there is no way to dye anything with it. The dye is insoluble and cannot adhere to fiber. And moreover, once it's made soluble at a molecular level, a process the ancients somehow managed to figure out, that's me explaining, the dye matter itself is invisible, and dye matter itself is invisible, and it's only oxygen that makes it blue. So what takes place is a double-step chemical operation, the breaking down of a molecule followed by its reconstruction. And I realized at that moment that I was in way over my head. Never mind history, I also wasn't very good at chemistry. So I really had to reach out for help, and I was very lucky to go to, in fact, Stephen had known somebody who's involved in the Historic Charleston Foundation and knew of a group that were putting together a fundraiser to raise money to restore Eliza's sack back dress, is what it's called. And she had this beautiful silk dress that was somebody in her family had kept, and it was in a trunk at the bottom of somebody's bed, and then it was in an attic, and and then several generations wore it until that sort of fell out of style. So it had been put through some stuff, but it was Eliza's dress, and it was woven of silk that came from her plantations later on. And they were raising money to restore it, and there was an event in Charleston, so I immediately leapt in the car and went down there and met some really fascinating historians who definitely gave me way more insight and pointed me in the right direction of how to get sort of more family history. And there was a lady there, Donna Hardy, from Sea Island Indigo. And I was so relieved when I got to the point of the book that I could call somebody or send a mad email because I was sort of, hair standing on end, standing there going, I'm never going to finish the book because I don't understand Indigo. And she said to me, look, I'm going down to Ossabaw Island this weekend. There's wild indigo growing. We're going to pick some. I'm going to show you how it's done. And it's the last time I'm doing that this year. It doesn't bloom. I mean, this is November. She's like, this is the last one of the year. Unless you want to wait until after the next harvest next summer. And I was like, I will be there. So I found myself at 6 o'clock the next morning on a boat in the mist, going out to Ossabaw Island, and had an incredible day discovering what actually goes on. And I know that Carolyn and Laurie will be better equipped, and you should definitely, if you haven't, definitely do an indigo workshop of some kind, if you're interested in it. But all that to say, I finally cracked that one, and then I had to figure out why her story was so important. And when I spent a lot of time in libraries and things in Charleston, and I found so many fortuitous documents. The Pinckney papers are there. I was able to, Ben, who I call Ben in the book, this person that was sent from the islands to help Eliza, kept being alluded to, but there was never, he was like the ghost in the pages. I knew there was somebody there. But as what happens with a lot of historical records is families come through and they're like, well, that doesn't really fit with our family story, so we'll keep this part of it, and we won't keep that part of it. And as I'm sure Bill will attest, trying to find sort of obscure family documents and letters and piece together a full picture takes a little time. But there was a man who was sent from the islands, and he obviously was super instrumental to understanding indigo for Eliza, but also all of the enslaved people who came from Africa, they had a different way of doing the same thing and had been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. So those two things together, I mean, for me, that probably made it doubly complicated. But in the end, she was fully committed to working with the people on her plantation. I was so lucky that previous historians before me had found records of the enslaved people on her plantation, knew them by name, because sadly, there were bills of sale and lading, that sort of listed humans alongside dressers and drawers. I mean, it's just impossible to think of that today. And so I was able to use people's real names. They're not nameless, faceless people who helped her do this thing. And we owe such a huge debt of gratitude, actually, to all the people who worked with her on the plantation and they really were an absolute team. Quash, who's her main overseer, went on to, she ended up freeing him, and he went on to become a woodworker and architect, and he built the Pinckney Mansion on East Bay Street. It has since perished in a fire, but he is, without a doubt, our first documented African-American architect. And there's a lot of work there's somebody doing a dissertation on him right now who's found more historical record on him, which is so fantastic. So we're starting to piece together all of this lost history. But in the end, I want to tell you that the indigo went on to sort of be over 1 million pounds of exported indigo dyed per year. Or that George Washington ended up being a pallbearer at her funeral. But I will say that she left a legacy. She left a legacy of children who read and who would learn, and there was a quest for knowledge. I think we know now that sort of Thomas Pinckney, so her sons were Thomas and Charles. She did have a son that passed away, and then she had a daughter, Harriet. Charles and Thomas grew up to be extremely important. Thomas was the architect of the Pinckney Treaty, which gave the US use of the Mississippi River for trade and delineated the current boundary that's still in place today between the United States and the Spanish colonies. And Charles obviously was a representative of the Constitutional Convention. He was very important in some of the cultural and educational things that happened in South Carolina in that time. And in both of those, her boys are what people remember, or who people remember. But I think now we know that Eliza, who was so well read, who was stealing law books from Charles Pinckney's library, who was teaching herself the law because she didn't want women in the neighborhood to be left destitute when their husbands passed away. She was writing wills to make sure that people were protected. I think we can now thank her for how her sons turned out. So much of Indigo's legacy is what you just look around today and see. And that the most important part of that is the foundational wealth that swept across this area that ultimately was able to rebuff the British and to win our independence. And having grown up in England, you know, I'm not British when I grew up there. I definitely feel more American because I've spent more of my life here. But you know, I look around and I think this would be a different country. You know, the foundational wealth that Indigo, with the time that it came and when it came, is absolutely a legacy and a bedrock of who we are, why we are, and who we are today. And obviously your South Carolina state flag. South Carolina didn't forget either. That indigo blue state flag. Definitely it's indigo blue. So in conclusion, because I feel like I've gone all around the houses, and I thought I would follow my notes, and instead you just got me freewheeling all over the place. I did feel like Bill the most important bullet points. In writing her story, I really wanted to know, I wanted the world to know that a young girl existed who was utterly unique and courageous and unwilling to rest in the status quo. She was a humanitarian as well as a capitalist. She favored fairness, but she was still ambitious, and she was spiritually devout, but never sanctimonious about it. And she had so many societal expectations and setbacks, but she still did what she was put on this earth to do, what she felt she was put on this earth to do, to raise her family above poverty, to do what she could for her country, and to treat all humans with respect and dignity. And that her accomplishments really were a keystone in American history. And that really and truly, we owe her a debt that can never be repaid. Well, it can only be repaid by never forgetting her. And that will be it from me. I'm sure this Thank you so much. And I would also like to say one more thing. It's such a beautiful place here, and there's so much history, I think, on the island, and it's so important that you guys have a historical society on the island who's doing what they can to preserve it. So yeah, really, thank you for that. Any questions? I know it's a big room, so don't be shy. I've had to stand here and speak to all of you, so I know you can speak up and ask any questions. Yes?
How long did it take you to complete?
Okay, so January 14th was when I spoke to my agent. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this thing, I think. That was 2014, I worked on it, 2015. 2016, the publisher bought it, but they didn't publish it until 2017. And during that time, I mean, I was still working on it. Like, there were things I couldn't put aside, you know, this is wrong. Or coming across, I was telling somebody at the table earlier, there's little things that you don't realize, like I think at one point I had described Mrs. Pinkney's dress as being rose pink, and then came to find out that a rose was not seen outside of China until the end of the 1700s, and only then at the Royal Botanical Gardens in London. So unless you had visited and were invited, by the royal family to go stroll around the Botanical Gardens, you had not seen a rose. And so there were just little things like that that just took a lot of...
It took a long time.
It did. And luckily he cooks. So it did well.
Could you tell us a little about your writing discipline? How did you get this done?
I should be more disciplined. I've definitely, we've moved a lot, and I feel like every time I find a rhythm, something changes. I feel like I'm always one, if anybody follows my newsletter, they probably saw in February that I wrote this thing about a room of one's own. I seem to shuffle myself down the list of having a desk to work at and a room to work out of. So I'm going to stop doing that, and doing those things. But working in the mornings and getting it out of the way is the best that works for me. But it takes a lot of, there's a lot of writing that happens in your head before you ever get anything on the page. And I think every writer finds that really, like from talking to other writers. So I would say that the discipline is lacking, could be improved. Yes. Yes.
Do you ever see yourself letting us know more about Eliza's later work?
Oh, yeah.
I do not see that, but I didn't for a while. Okay, so for those who didn't hear, do I see myself maybe writing about Eliza's later life? I was really saddened by her later life. I mean, she had a very full marriage to Mr. Pinkney, to Charles. They were very much in love. And I was personally devastated when I read her letters when he passed away. She was absolutely heartbroken. And I just don't know that I want to write that. I feel like there was so much he believed in her so strongly from when she was 16, he would call her his little visionary. And he would always be excited to find out what little schemes she had going on, what she was growing and what she thought it could be. And he was became such a big part of her and her husband became such a team. And I don't know that there's much after that that feels uplifting for me. And the legacy, I think her biggest legacy, I think the legacy part of what she did in her early life was also a big part of writing her story. And I don't know that there's a legacy after that. Does that make sense?
Maybe Ben comes back. He didn't really drown.
I know. Did Ben really die? So I'll leave that to you all to decide, because personally, I don't think he died. There was a lot of indigo suddenly flourished in Florida after that time, so maybe it was Ben. But yeah, there's so many. I wish that we knew more about that person. Like if I could find more about Ben, or like that person that existed who I called Ben, I would love to know more about that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, movie interest or series interest. Yes is the short answer, but so right when it first came out, we had an option contract on it. It was a duo of producers who were very well connected and very well respected, like it was a real thing. It kind of fizzled. These things fizzle. The partnership that they were fell apart, and we were one of the casualties that sort of fell apart along with it. Then I think people became a little nervous about it because of the fact of the backdrop of, enslaved people on the plantation, whose story really is it? I think I tried very hard to make sure that it felt like a team effort in the book, but obviously it's called the Indigo Girl. We have recently had, so there's a scriptwriter who I've been working with in Hilton Head who reached out to me, who was like, I really want to write this script. And then separately to that, there is another person right now who has a shopping agreement on it. I've had to learn all these terms, which doesn't really mean anything because I think 0.0001% of books get optioned, and 0.001% of those ever make it to like finding somebody, a producer, and 0.001% get funded, and then 0.001% ever get greenlit to a movie. So I'm excited and hopeful. I feel sure that it's going to be a story that at some point will make it to more people that way, visually. I just think it's an important enough story, and it would be great, actually, if it was a series and not a movie, because there's so much history around that time that could be brought in and just tell a much broader story. So, yes. Yes. I'm taking a sabbatical. We moved to Spain. That was a lot. I sort of feel like I'm finding my feet. I woke up at the beginning of the year all like, okay, it's 2023, I'm ready to go. And now we're in April, I'm like, still 2023. Not quite sure what's going on. I think I needed a mental break for a second. I feel like we've been running non-stop. But I think for the first time in a really long time, I really want to write another historical fiction. And I hadn't for a long time because this was a labor of love, it was a passion project. I threw so much of myself into it. And I was like, well, that's it now, I've done that thing. And the publisher obviously wanted me to write another one because they're like, well, this is done great, let's get more of this. But it's just not that easy to find somebody that lights you up like that. I like the first person style, so I really have to believe in the person that I'm writing about. I like that she did something important, and I like that it's a woman's story. There's just not enough, there aren't enough women's stories. I mean, when you think about it, it's true. I mean, it's called history. It's like his story has been written about, like, history's been written by men for for hundreds of years. And I know that there's a lot of great women's stories coming out, and that have been out, and there's more to be told. So I just have to find the right one. It feels good for me. Yes.
Will you stay aside some books for us?
Yes, I will sign books. And honestly, I know that my romances are totally different. But I have some romance books out there that Beaufort Bookstore very kindly brought in case anybody likes romance too. The biggest selling genre on the planet. So, and all of my stories are set in the Low Country, apart from Broken French, which starts in Charleston and then ends up on a yacht in the Mediterranean. And he's a dirty talking Frenchman, I'm just warning you. But yes, I would love to sign books, and I will sign my romance books too. Yes.
I heard conversations and interviews about you wanting to retire your husband.
Well, then buy a book. No, thank you so much for coming. I feel so honored. And everyone who wore indigo. Yes, thank you.